All right, welcome back. So now we're going to talk about the second part of this week's lesson, looking at replication. Replication makes a lot of sense for science. It's part of the whole how we check ourselves, how we make sure that what we're doing is not a fluke that we found the results, but that it's reliable across experimenters, across different measures, across different populations. It's kind of the checks and balances inherent in the scientific method, but we don't do it that much. So this is part of the problem. So we'll talk a little bit more about that right now. Um, we can replicate exactly, so doing everything exactly the same way as the original study. So that would be called an exact replication. But we can also do an approximate replication, which would be by changing some aspects of the study, but not all. So looking at, does this show up with a different age group? Does this show up with a different measure, etc. So that's kind of testing the generalizability um, in looking at, does this work with other groups, or done slightly different ways. So you could change the sample. Does this work with, I did the study in Chicago. Does it work with folks in California? Ages, we like to do this a lot in developmental science. So looking at, so this worked with early elementary. Does this work with later elementary? Ethnicity, looking for differences across well-being, ways that people think about and handle mental illness. So that's more like a cultural differences, community differences that may also be linked to ethnicity. Socioeconomic status, similarly, looking at different people's quantities of resources and how that might influence some of the concepts that we're looking at. Paid versus volunteer, this is an interesting one. So looking at the motivation of the participants. It may be the case that giving participants more compensation for participating in a study may change how they participate or how they answer. Another thing is community versus clinic. Another way you might say this would be a normative versus pathological sample. Some of our research has been done looking at the effects of disorders in clinical samples, and it's hard to figure out what that looks like in for folks who are experiencing some similar symptomology but not at a clinical level. So, or vice versa, right? So looking at stress in college students doesn't necessarily tell you much about what people who are dealing with major anxiety how they're handling stress, because it may be very different at different levels of anxiety. Lab versus real life. We've talked about the choice to do a laboratory study versus a quasi-experimental. If you control everything, it's hard to know whether that situation or that relationship, those phenomena would hold up in the real world. So that might be a good thing to mess with in replication. The issue with failure to replicate is that it's often hard to figure out without more replications, which, as I said at the outset, these are infrequent. But it's often hard to tell without more replications what changed. So if I run a survey looking at sharing behavior, and this sharing behavior looks like it is really consistent and getting kids to share in this one scenario for 4-year-olds. And then I do the same thing with 5-year-olds. Let's see if these 5-year-olds are sharing in the same scenario. The only thing that I've changed is the age, and the 5-year-olds don't do it. Is it because they're older? Is it because they're different kids? Is it because some fluke made the ones that I studied the first time work, and then there's something else going on here? It's hard to tell without doing more replications. So again, replication is really important. We need more of them. There's some important reasons why we don't do them. So reasons that we should do them. One study doesn't necessarily tell you anything. It could be something about the particular population that you've used, maybe they're not all that representative of the larger population of interest. It's hard to tell that sometimes. Um, Looking at one study that's kind of addressing a phenomena, uh, any one study has lots of limitations. You only look at it one particular way. There are caveats. There's only so much you can actually test in one research study. So in order to kind of control for all those things or really get down to what's going on with the concept or phenomenon of interest, you need to do lots of studies. Um, so it is the results that are most reliable, that we most want to build theories on, the most that we most kind of can trust as researchers, are those that can be replicated or that have been replicated with small changes. An example here is a study that I did in this picture with 3 kiddos who were communicating nonverbally and helping one another in making an origami figure. They're each making their own origami figure, and they were given kind of vague instructions by the lady who's sitting at the other end of the table writing at this in this picture. These kids in the picture are in Mexico. We looked at compared them with kids in the same grade in the U.S. who did much less nonverbal communication, talked a lot more, and worked independently a lot more. So this was one study that we did. Some problems with the study. It is a lab study, right? This is an artificial kind of scenario. These kids are not doing origami all the time. Does this look like how they share or work together or communicate outside of the lab? We think so, but the case could be made that this is an artificial context, so it's not how they interact outside of the classroom, right? So the reason that this phenomena, we kind of believe that this is really something going on, that kids in rural parts of Mexico are more likely to work as a group, to help each other, and to communicate nonverbally, is that we have lots of other studies, some of which I've listed here, that have found similar things using slightly different methodology. So with that kind of heft of or significant kind of across studies, across researchers, across authors research, we can argue, yeah, there is a agreement in the field that kids who have grown up in communities where, like many rural communities in Mexico, where you are learning from observing and pitching into what's going on in the community, those kids are really likely to collaborate, help each other, and to be pretty skilled at using nonverbal communication to get that done. So, yes. Some of the reasons we would not do replications: it's hard to get them published. They're not one of the things that's good for getting things published is it's got to be new, right? Well, by definition, a replication, especially an exact replication, is not new, right? Important, but not new. So the wow factor, the sexy factor, to try to get something published, because it's not new. On the other hand, as I said, we trust factors, we trust findings that have been found by a lot of different people in a lot of different using a lot of different methodologies. Conceptual replication is the replication of concepts or some aspect of a relationship between variables. Exact replication is when you do the exact same thing following exactly the same procedure, context, very similar population as someone else. So our problem in psychology writ large is that when we've tried to do exact replications or even conceptual replications, only about 30% of the replications that are attempted are successful. So that means that when other people have tried to find the same thing as some of the even major findings in the fields, they've not been able to. this is problematic because it makes you question what was going on with that first um, experiment study to make that so that it couldn't be replicated. What happened in between those two um, attempts? One response to this is what a project called the Mini Labs project. If you look up your slides, there's a link to it. This shows exact replications across lots of countries of looking at the same exact procedure, the same concept. In the Mini Labs project, they've found that 54% of their findings are in the same direction as the original study. Doesn't mean they're exact same finding, but the same direction as the same study. About 25% found a larger effect size and 75% found a smaller effect size. Remember, effect size is how big that difference is between groups or between means, right? So it is significance is whether we can bet on 99 times out of 100 it's going to be this way, and effect size is how much difference we're talking about. So for the replications, 25% was more different, and 75% was a smaller difference that they found. So again, lack of replication is a bad thing because any one study, there could be a lot of things going on with it. On the other hand, this problem with replication is not unique to psychology. And there are some areas of psychology that seem to do better than others. Content analysis, archival research seem to do better. Quasi-experimental research, because it's quasi-experimental and there's so little that's controlled, it's really hard to replicate, hard to find things that are going to be looking at exact replications. Conceptual, maybe. Even that is a little bit subjective, but it's harder to replicate. The other thing is that in some cases, people have argued that the replication crisis is not such a bad crisis because it's not as bad as we initially thought. So if you look at meta-analysis of the fields, there was strong replication and moderate replication in 35%, and failures in 40%. Yeah, that's not so bad. One example of this is the power pose example. So in this case, on the slides, there's a video you can watch, a TED Talk by this author talking about how people's body posture may or may not relate to how they are perceived and how their testosterone levels. So kind of biochemical indicators about how they're reacting and interacting with others. There haven't been any direct replications of her work, but in conceptual replications, 34% of the studies that were done supported her research. 3 contested it, so found different findings, and the results were mixed in 13 for different studies. So there's some support for some aspects of her claims. Others are a little bit fuzzier. And so it's hard to figure out what to do with this more mixed results. So some reasons for this crisis. If you're looking at a small effect size, remember I gave the example, I think earlier on in this class, of the effect size in vocabulary difference between males and females is really small. So there is reliably